It is good to be with you this morning. I am honored to be back with you and on this Easter Sunday. You may recall from my previous visits to your pulpit that I am a newly ordained UU minister, having graduated from seminary just last year. In other words, I'm a rookie, and this is my very first Easter sermon. I suspect the Easter sermon inspires much head scratching and hands frozen over the keyboard angst for UU clergy, even for my veteran colleagues. Resurrection is a hard concept for many Unitarian Universalists, and ministers are no exception. How do we draw meaning and inspiration from a holiday with a miracle at its center, a supernatural miracle, when so many of us, so many UUs shrink from the very concept of miracles? Last time I tried, it didn't go so well. This is my first full-fledged Easter sermon, but once before I was tasked with sharing the Easter story. The occasion was a children's chapel service at my home congregation. The crowd was tough, about a dozen school-aged Unitarian Universalist youth. I knew I had completely lost them when one of the boys yelled out, "You mean Jesus was a zombie?" The kids got up. They got hung up on the supernatural dimension of the story, and they couldn't get past it. I think that happens for a lot of UU adults too, inclined as we are towards the use of reason, regard for science, and reverence for the natural world. Can these bones live? God asked the Hebrew prophet Ezekiel ages before Christ's followers discovered his empty tomb. Can life come back from death? I think the boy from my children's chapel would have had a quick, smart aleck retort to God's question. But what if God was getting at something a bit more nuanced and more profound? What answers might we discover if we let go of our hang-ups and stay with the question, with our reason firmly intact, but also with a spirit of openness and curiosity? What might we learn from the idea of resurrection that is relevant to our lives and our Unitarian Universalist faith today? And so to explore this question, I am going to invite you to consider 3 stories of resurrection this morning. And taken together, they call us not to believe in resurrection in a physical, literal way, but rather to practice resurrection, to live resurrection in a spiritual and ethical sense. Our first story is the one I've already alluded to from Hebrew scripture, the book of the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a Jewish prophet in the 6th century before the Common Era, exiled in Babylon with his fellow Judeans after the fall of the temple in Jerusalem. The Jews in Babylon were hopeless and despairing, cut off as they were from their land, their temple, and the practice of their faith. In this context, God comes to Ezekiel and shares a vision of resurrection in the valley of dry bones. The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, "Son of man, can these bones live?" God goes on to show Ezekiel the answer. "I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life." So I prophesied as he commanded me, Ezekiel says, And as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. There you have it, a vast army of enfleshed, breathing, former skeletons marching out of their mass grave. Alas, we've arrived at the part of the story where my Chalice Chapel kids start cracking jokes about zombies, the part where I lose them, and maybe some of you. Except it's not the end of the story, for God goes on to explain to Ezekiel the meaning of the resurrected bones. Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what the Lord, sovereign Lord says. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. I will put my spirit in you and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. The resurrection that matters in this story is not so much the literal resurrection of the dry bones. That vision of resurrected bones represents the people of Israel who in their exile have died not a physical but a spiritual death, a death of hope and faith. The resurrection of the dry bones makes manifest an invisible spiritual resurrection, the restoration of the exiled Israelites' covenant with their God. The resurrection is not the completion of the miracle, but rather points towards the future when the Israelites will be brought back to their own land, restored to their rightful relationship with God according to the covenant. Re-enlivened by God's Spirit, the exiled Israelites are called to live and breathe and practice their renewed faith into the promise of the future. Our second story brings us to another tomb, the one at the center of the Easter story, as told in the Gospel of Matthew. It is the Sunday morning after Jesus was killed, and Mary Magdalene, along with the so-called other Mary, have made their way to the tomb, prepared to ritually anoint Jesus's body with spices according to their customs. Except when they arrive, the stone is rolled away dramatically as if by an earthquake, and instead of the body of Jesus within, they encounter an angel of the Lord who bears a striking message. Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. The women having delivered their message, the disciples do gather in Galilee as instructed, where Jesus appears before them. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Jesus rises from death and emerges from his tomb, appearing before his disciples to assert his divine authority. However, he does not remain long embodied on earth, walking and preaching and teaching alongside his disciples in the flesh. His earthly reappearance is short-lived before his ascension to heaven. Ultimately, the resurrection of his body seems to matter less than the resurrection of his message and his ministry, for he leaves his disciples with a commission. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Jesus is with his followers always, not in body, but in spirit, in their hearts, as they live and breathe and carry out his promise in their words and deeds. The disciples and generations of followers to come are the ones who embody Christ's resurrection through time. These two stories from the scriptural traditions that inform our Unitarian Universalist tradition today, these two stories give us an understanding of resurrection that is more than the suspect miracle of the dead rising from the grave. The stories invite us as spiritual descendants to resurrect the promises, the wisdom, the work, and the love of the ancestors who lived and died before us. They invite us to give our living energy to their spirits. Still, these stories may be remote and obscure to many of us, especially if we do not come from or have left behind a Jewish or Christian identity. So for our third and final story, I want to visit the life of one of our more recent Unitarian prophets, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, whose life and legacy may be more accessible to our sensibilities and more relevant to our spiritual and moral concerns today. Harper was unequivocally a Christian with dual denominational affiliations. She was a lifelong member, an active member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, but later also joined the Unitarians in Philadelphia, likely attracted by their leadership in abolition. In her Christian faith, we observe priorities that align with our contemporary UU values and principles. Our cherished belief in the inherent worth and dignity of all human beings, our commitment to serve the cause of justice and liberation for all siblings in the human family, our longing for the beloved community where all human beings, in all our glorious diversity, are assured of our belonging. Harper worked and wrote and spoke and ministered tirelessly to bring these values to their full fruition as a nationally renowned poet and writer of fiction, a lecturer, an abolitionist, a suffragist, a mother, and a Sunday school teacher. Even though she lived to see the end of the Civil War and the formal end of the American system of chattel slavery, her work was not complete when she died in 1911. That fruit did not come to full bloom. Southern white legislators had cruelly reversed the political and economic gains Black people made during Reconstruction. Jim Crow segregation and its attendant violence and terror were on the rise. Women had yet to win the vote, and Black men across the country were increasingly disenfranchised. In her 1854 poem, Bury Me in a Free Land, our reading this morning, Harper foresaw the possibility of her death before the full liberation of her people. Make me a grave where'er you will, in a lowly plain or a lofty hill. Make it among earth's humblest graves, but not in a land where men are slaves. I ask no monument proud and high to arrest the gaze of passers-by. All that my yearning spirit craves is bury me not in a land of slaves. While slavery was nominally abolished at the time of her death, the land was not yet free. Nor is it today, as we are so starkly reminded by the approaching anniversary of the killing of George Floyd and the trial of his killer, who at the time of Floyd's death bore the uniform of state authority. Sadly, in many respects, Harper's yearning spirit was buried along with her body. For decades, her work and legacy were dismissed and neglected by historians, scholars, and activists, buried in the tomb of forgotten history by the forces of white supremacy and patriarchy that animated her resistance in her lifetime. Yet true to her word, Harper's spirit could not rest. And she seems to have called out from the grave to future generations of Black womanist scholars and Black Unitarian Universalists. Through their research, they uncovered Harper's life work and breathed new energy into her legacy through their scholarship, ministries, and activism. And this brings me to my favorite part of Harper's story, and to yet one more grave site. Modern day UUs learned that Harper's body was buried in an unmarked grave at Eden Cemetery in Philadelphia. In 1992, a group of African-American UUs pilgrimaged to the gravesite to give her the memorial she was due. When they unsettled the dirt to place the newly engraved stone, they discovered that an original stone had in fact been placed at the grave, but had toppled over and been buried beneath decades of earth and grass. I cannot help but think of Harper's restless spirit, perhaps causing that stone to topple. As Harper's UU descendants raised that buried stone, they both literally and metaphorically resurrected her legacy. And while this moment of poetic drama is moving, the true meaning of the story is not about a literal resurrection, but a spiritual one. Just as God and Jesus pointed to the future and commissioned their followers to live out the promises of their ancestors, Harper's prophetic message is also future-oriented. In a brief poem that closes her most famous novel, Iola Leroy, Harper invokes that promised future where her vision of liberation is fully realized. There is light beyond the darkness, joy beyond the present pain. Though the morning seems to linger or the hilltops far away, yet the shadows bear the promise of a brighter coming day. Let us, Harper's faithful UU descendants, live out the resurrection of her legacy in our lives and ministries with our hearts and spirits, hands and feet, our very muscles and bones. May it be so.